All right, let's talk about it. Today we are heading back to what is probably the most terrifying town in all of fiction, Derry, Maine. The new prequel series, Welcome to Derry, is finally here, promising to dig into the origins of Pennywise's evil, and yeah, the first reviews are dropping. So we're going to dig into the first big review from IGN to break down what's working, what isn't, and whether you should really be afraid to go back. Let's get into it.
So, first things first, to really get Welcome to Derry, you gotta remember the #1 rule of Stephen King's world. Evil in this town, it's a cycle. It's this curse that wakes up every 27 years to feed on fear. And this new series, well, it's throwing us right back into that horrifying loop.
And you know, right out of the gate, this IGN review makes it clear this isn't just going to be some Monster of the Week show. This quote points to something way deeper. The idea is to show how Pennywise isn't just a creature that visits Derry, but a rot that is literally part of the town's foundation.
Okay, so Section 1, our return to America's worst town. Now, this is not a reboot. You gotta know it's a direct prequel to those 2 recent blockbuster movies. And it's got the same creative mastermind behind it, Andy Muschietti, who directed both It Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. He's back in the director's chair for the first 4 episodes, which means we're getting that same consistent and, frankly, terrifying vision.
Now, here's what the review says is the biggest promise of the whole show: digging into Derry's dark and bloody past. The original novel is just packed with these historical chapters that detail the town's horrific history, parts that have never, ever been fully adapted for the screen before. This series is finally going there.
And look, if you're a fan of the book, you know these are some of the most chilling parts of the entire story. The reviewer sounds genuinely excited to finally see these things brought to life. I'm talking about the racially charged fire at the Black Spot nightclub, or all those mysterious mass casualty events that have just defined Derry for centuries. This is the deep, dark stuff we've been waiting for.
The show also makes this really interesting creative choice with its setting. Remember how the movies moved the kid's story to the 80s to get that Stranger Things vibe? Well, this prequel sets its story in the 1960s. The review calls this a dramatically fertile shift. And it makes sense, right? You're dropping Pennywise's supernatural horror right into the middle of the real-world tensions of the civil rights movement, which is just a perfect backdrop for exploring the kind of deep-seated hate that it loves to feed on.
Okay, but it's not all perfect, and this gets us to the review's main criticism, a tale of 2 very different storylines. The first episode is basically split right down the middle, and the quality between the 2 plots is, well, it's really unbalanced. It's both the show's biggest strength and its biggest weakness, right from the start.
And yeah, the split is pretty dramatic. On one hand, you've got the storyline following the kids, which is described as the scariest and most effective part of the whole thing, just filled with this creeping dread. But then you've got the plot with the adults, and the review calls that one laborious. It feels like slow, disconnected setup that just hasn't really connected to the Pennywise horror of it all. At least, not yet.
And this all leads the reviewer to a point that, let's be honest, will sound super familiar to any IT fan. The premiere just reinforces what we've always kind of known. The story, in pretty much every version, is just better when we're seeing it through the eyes of the kids on the front lines.
And if you want proof of just how well this kid's story works, the review points straight to the show's stellar opening sequence. It's about a young boy named Matty Clemens who hitches a ride with absolutely the wrong family. The reviewer just raves about the escalating tension and the editing, calling it a fantastic piece of psychological horror that promises a lot more good stuff to come.
All right, so this is all great, but let's get to the question I know is on everyone's mind. What about the star of the show? Where in the world is Pennywise in all of this?
Let's just put it out there. After all this buildup, after all this talk, do we actually get to see Bill Skarsgård's iconic, terrifying performance as the killer clown?
Well, the answer is kinda, but not really. And the review argues this is actually a brilliant move. The show treats Pennywise less like a character you see and more like an ominous background presence. By keeping him in the shadows, his threat feels constant, and that dread just builds and builds so much more effectively.
So instead of these big monster reveals, you get these terrifying little flashes of evil. The review points out how just a quick glimpse of Pennywise's cocked eye in the dark, or his giant buck teeth suddenly appearing in another character's mouth, is actually way more unsettling than some big CG monster. It's subtle, and it really, really works.
All right, let's wrap this all up. You've got one strong half, one weak half, a monster who's mostly hiding off screen. So what's the final verdict from IGN? Should you pack your bags for a trip back to Derry?
So here's the final breakdown. The show is apparently brilliant, with its stylish, tense vibe and its awesome use of the novel's lore, especially when it's focused on the kids. The premiere's biggest weakness is that slow adult plot that creates this real imbalance in the story, plus a few scares that lean a little too heavily on computer effects.
But even with those flaws, the review ends on this really powerful note. The show absolutely nails its most important job. It recreates that uniquely chilling, oppressive feeling of being in Derry. In a weird way, it makes you feel right at home.
Which brings us to the final score from IGN, a very, very strong 8 out of 10. The reviewer clearly sees this as a super promising start, where the good stuff far outweighs the early bumps in the road.
So, when you boil it all down, the takeaway is that Welcome to Derry is a seriously tense and worthwhile return to this terrifying world. And yeah, while one of its big storylines feels a bit waterlogged at the moment, there's plenty of time for it to rise to the surface and, as the reviewer cleverly puts it, start floating.
And that's where we'll leave it, with one last question for you. Based on what you've heard from this first look, will you be making a trip back to Derry?